The medieval Polish tribes, including the Polans, Vistulans, Silesians, and Pomeranians, formed the foundation of what would eventually become the Kingdom of Poland. The Polans, centered in the Greater Poland region around modern Poznań and Gniezno, were the most politically dominant tribe. They were agriculturalists and cattle herders, with a developing hierarchical society led by a chieftain. Their strategic position along trade routes helped them gain power, eventually unifying other tribes under the Piast dynasty. The House of Piast was the first historical ruling dynasty of Poland. The first documented Polish monarch was Duke Mieszko, the first of the Piast dynasty. The Vistulans lived along the upper Vistula River, centered around Kraków. They are known for building strongholds or gords and engaging in agriculture, cattle breeding, and trade. The Silesians inhabited the region around Wrocław, near the Silesia mountain, a sacred site in their pagan beliefs. They were skilled in metallurgy and trade, using the Oder River for transportation and exchange. Their territory became a key part of early Polish unification efforts. The Pomeranians lived along the Baltic coast in modern-day Pomerania. Pomeranians were known for their maritime economy, including fishing, amber trade, and boat building. Their coastal location put them in frequent contact with Scandinavians, Baltic peoples, and Germanic merchants. The tribe shared common features of early medieval Slavic society. They practiced slash-and-burn farming, growing rye, oats, and barley, and raising cattle, pigs, and sheep. Skilled in weaving, blacksmithing, and pottery, they produced goods for local use and trade. Villages were organized around gords, fortified settlements that served as political and religious centers. Pagan beliefs dominated until Christianization in the 10th century, with worship of gods like Purin and sacred natural sites. Early Polish pottery was primarily handmade and utilitarian, with simple shapes and decorations like incised or stamped patterns. With increased trade and cultural exchange, wheel-thrown pottery and glazed ceramics became more common, reflecting outside influences. The tribes built gords, circular wooden fortifications with earthworks and palisades. These gords often served as tribal centers. Post-Christianization, Romanesque stone architecture began to appear, particularly in churches and monasteries. The first historical capital of Poland, Gniezno, was a Poland stronghold and a religious center tied to the early Christianization of Poland. For this video, I gathered the genomes of 7 medieval Poles, dating to 2nd, 10th, and 12th centuries. 3 of the medieval Poles I have gathered were Polans. 1 was a Vistulan, 1 was a Silesian, and 2 were Pomeranians. I ran the samples through my trait predictor tool for DNA analysis. The link to purchase, which will be in the description of the video, along with the purchase link for the 7 raw DNA files in 23andMe format. 6 of the 7 samples were male, and of the 6 samples, 3 carried Y lineage R1A. 2 samples carried Y lineage R1B, and 1 sample carried the Y lineage I1A. The most common phenotype among the medieval Poles was North Ponted, although other phenotypes, including exotic phenotypes such as Indo, Nordid, and Mediterranean, were present in the group. Here is a morph of the average predicted phenotype. The most common eye color was green, which 3 people had. No sample was predicted to have brown or dark brown eyes. The most common hair color was dark blonde, which 4 people had. 1 person had light brown, and 2 people had dark brown hair. Every sample was predicted to have white skin tone. Regarding hair shape, the most common predicted hair shape among the medieval Poles was wavy, which 3 people scored, followed by straight and kinky, which 2 people scored. 5 people scored a Greek nose shape, and 2 people scored snub as their predicted nose shape. 3 of the 7 Poles were predisposed to male pattern hair loss, and 4 of the 7 Poles were predisposed to taller height. 2 of the samples were predisposed to lower odds of kidney stones. 2 samples were carriers and had high odds of hemoglobin E disease, and 1 sample had low odds of migraine. 1 sample had high odds of lupus, 1 sample had high odds of gout, and 1 sample had low odds of eczema. Every sample had average odds of polycystic ovary syndrome. 1 sample had high odds of age-related cataracts, and the Poles were strongly predisposed to age-related macular degeneration. Every sample had average odds of epilepsy. 1 sample had high odds of asthma, and one sample had low odds of vitiligo. One sample had high odds of myopia, one sample had high odds of corneal astigmatism, and one sample had high odds of primary biliary cirrhosis. Regarding their dopaminergic profile, these early polls were strongly predisposed to the worrier profile and higher dopamine levels and slower rate of dopamine reuptake, which leads to poorer stress tolerance. The early polls were split evenly between more D2 receptor sites and fewer D2 receptor sites. One sample had a low predisposition to Tourette's, one sample had a low predisposition to ADHD, two samples had a low predisposition to depression, and three samples had a low predisposition to bipolar disorder. Not a single sample had an above-average predisposition to any mental health condition, which is quite peculiar. Two samples had high odds of autism, and five samples had intermediate odds of autism. Two samples had lower levels of empathy, three samples had intermediate, and two samples had higher levels of empathy based on OXDR genotypes. The medieval polls were predisposed to lower odds of epithelial cancers on the basis of 8q24 genotypes. Nonetheless, two samples had high odds of breast cancer, and two samples had high odds of glioma. One sample had low odds of thyroid cancer, and every sample that had a genotype for KITLG had homozygous risk genotype for testicular cancer. Moving on to blood cancers, the samples had average odds of polycythemia vera on the basis of JAK2 genotypes and average odds of leukemia. The medieval polls had average odds of allergies, and five of them carried risk variants for rare conditions, the most common of which was Parkinson's disease. One sample was predicted to have higher levels of plasma homocysteine, while two samples were predicted to have lower levels of homocysteine. One sample had high odds of ischemic stroke. One sample had low odds of atrial fibrillation. One sample had high odds of deep vein thrombosis, and two samples had high odds of a wide range of cardiovascular issues. The medieval polls had a low overall predisposition to autoimmune disease on the basis of HLA genotypes. Not a single sample had high odds of rheumatoid arthritis, one sample had high odds of type 1 diabetes, and one sample had high odds of multiple sclerosis and carried HLA-DRB1 risk variants for MS. Two samples had lower odds of obesity, while five samples had average odds of obesity. Two samples had very low odds of type 2 diabetes, while only one sample had low odds of Alzheimer's. The medieval polls had a high predisposition to alcohol addiction and low predisposition to syncope. The medieval polls had average red blood cell count, slight predisposition to shorter telomere lengths, and mostly good iron levels with the exception of two samples, one of which had low iron levels approaching anemia, and the other very high, approaching hemochromatosis. The medieval polls had a predisposition to average levels of vitamin D and slightly higher levels of LDL cholesterol. The most common blood types among the 7 medieval polls I gathered were O and A, but one person also carried the exceedingly rare blood type AB. Thank you for watching the video until the end. Don't forget to like and share if you enjoyed it. All the relevant links will be in the description.